Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcus DaCosta, and I'm here with my colleague, Mr. Larry Eady. And this morning, we will go ahead and present to you the understanding of cohort default rates and how to develop and implement an effective default prevention plan. I will be discussing the CDR component, and Mr. Eady will be discussing the default prevention plan. In our session today, what we will be going over is understanding the CDR process, the challenges and adjustments that you can submit as an institution to challenge your cohort default rate, the appeal process, risks and strategies, and creating an effective default prevention plan and target school engagement. As you see here on the slide, when the default prevention plan, not default prevention plan, I'm sorry, the cohort default rates are created, we are going off of a 3-year time frame. So as you see here, we're looking at those loans that went into repayment compared to those loans that went into default from October 1 of 2015, or it's always going to be October 1, up until September 30th of 2019, which will be 3 years down the road, which will equal that individual cohort default rate for that cycle. So as of right now, we are currently in the FY 2016 cohort default rate. Going into next year for our draft season, where the rates will be calculated in January and released to your institutions in February. And then, of course, when we calculate the rates in August and then released in September for the official cycle, that will be the FY 2017 cohort rate. So you'll be able to see what that information is that's made available to you. Of course, during the draft season, you're able to challenge your rates if you deem so. And then for the official cycle, where the rates are released to the public, you're able to submit an appeal for that cycle as well. Here, what you see is how we break everything down for you individually. For the first column, you have your cohort fiscal year going from 14 to 18, and you can see exactly when they'll be published. So as I've mentioned earlier, your FY 16 rates, which 16, where we're currently in, was published in 2019, and then your FY 17 cohort will be released in 2020. And as you see, in the borrowers and numerator and borrowers and denominator of how we pull those individual borrowers that go into repayment, as well as those individual borrowers that go into default, of how they fall into that scope, and then looking at the 3-year time period for the numerator and the 1-year time period for the denominator. What is your 3-year cohort default rate? As you can see here, for schools having 30 or more borrowers entering repayment in a fiscal year, the school's cohort default rate via the non-average rate is the percentage of the school borrowers who entered repayment on certain FFEL loans or direct loans during the fiscal year and the default or meet the other specified conditions within the cohort rate. For schools with borrowers with 29 or fewer borrowers entering repayment during the fiscal year, the cohort default rate is the average rate based on the number of borrowers entering repayment over a 3-year period. When we're calculating the rates, we're looking at the non-average rate formula, and that's actually how you are determined, but we also do look at the average rate formula depending on where you fall within that scope. Here is how we determine the non-average rate formula, where it's the number of borrowers who are within the denominator who defaulted and met the specific conditions during that cohort period of time divided by the number of borrowers who entered repayment in the cohort fiscal year, which then will equal your cohort default rate. And for the average rate formula, pretty much the same thing, where the number of borrowers who in the denominator defaulted and met the other specified conditions during the cohort rate divided by the number of borrowers who entered the repayment in the cohort year and the 2 preceding fiscal years, which will equal your rate. Now, for those individual institutions who are deemed what we call subject to sanctions, if you fall within a specific range, it will be deemed as 3 years over 30%, which you could potentially lose your direct loan eligibility and your Pell Grant eligibility. And if you are deemed as 1 year over 40%, you run the risk of losing your direct loan eligibility only. When your institution submits an appeal to our office and we review those appeals, if we deem your appeal to be unsuccessful, what then happens is we notify program compliance, who ultimately makes the final determination whether or not your school will remain or lose its eligibility. Our office only makes the recommendation of your overall sanctions, but program compliance will make the final call. Here, you'll see here are individual challenges, adjustments, and appeals that you as an institution are able to submit. The incorrect data challenge in the first column for challenges under draft, and the petition rate index are the only ones that you can submit during the draft cycle. The official rates for in September are the adjustments and the appeals in the next two columns. Keep in mind, though, for the uncorrected data adjustment, you must submit an IDC in order to submit the uncorrected data challenge, which basically means that if you submitted an IDC in the draft cycle and the information was not corrected properly, then you can go ahead and submit the UDC in the official cycle. But if you did not submit an IDC in the draft cycle, you cannot submit a UDC in the official cycle in September. On this chart here gives you the specific timelines of when your appeals can be submitted. Excuse me. You have a specific period of time for each individual appeal. Failure to meet these individual guidelines and timelines will result in your appeal being rejected and either returned back to you, but of course you'll be notified accordingly that you missed the timeline. We are held by regulatory guidelines, so unfortunately these dates and timelines cannot be changed unless there are mitigating circumstances that have warranted that for us to go back and say, well, we'll go ahead and grant you an extension. And usually that's when there are technical issues on our end that have prevented you from submitting your appeal through the eCDR appeal system. And for those appeals that are paper only, they must be date stamped by the appropriate deadline date. So after you receive your rate, you have a period of 5 days to review your information, to notify us if there are any difficulties or technical challenges. Once that 5-day period has elapsed, then the 30-day period or the 45-day period starts to begin. And if your information is not submitted accurately, keep in mind that those appeals will be rejected. What I'm going to go through now is just give you a brief overview of the individual appeals that you can submit. I won't go into too much detail, but this information here will give you just a general overview as to each individual appeal that you can submit, and more information will be available on our individual website for the Cohort Default Rates team, and definitely if you have any questions at the end. So here you see the IDC, which is a school has data to show up on the bar on the LERTA, which is your loan record detail report, are incorrectly reported. You can only submit this during the draft cycle. And why file? The correction of the incorrect data will impact the overall rate. Possible incorrect data may be the borrower did not enter repayment during the cohort year, the borrower did not default for CDR purposes during the monitoring period, or the other borrowers entered repayment during the cohort period. For the petition rate index, alleges that the school should not be subject to loss or eligibility or potential placement on provisional certification based solely on its CDR because the school has a PRI that meets the specific criteria. This challenge can also be submitted during the draft cycle and or during the official periods. Why to file? The draft CDR suggests that the school will be subject to loss of eligibility or potential provisional certification after the release of the official CDR, and the official CDR release confirms that the school is subject to sanction or provisional certification. The uncorrect data appeal, which is what I briefly mentioned earlier, reflects the change that were incorrectly agreed to by the data manager or your servicer as a result of the IDC submitted after the release of the CDR rate but not reflected in the overall release. You can submit this during the official cycle, and why to file the school's LERTA report indicates that one or more borrowers agreed upon the change from the IDC are not reflected in the official CDR, and adjustment may possibly decrease or current CDR. The new date of appeal, the NDA, is the new data adjustment allows the school to challenge the accuracy of the new data included in the school's most recent official cohort default rate. You can submit this information during the official cycle. And why to file? A school's review of the LERTA for the draft and official rates show data newly included, excluded, or otherwise changed during the period between the calculation of the draft and official CDR. If errors are confirmed by the data manager, a school's rate will be adjusted. As I go through this information here, keep in mind that when you decide to submit your appeal or challenge, this information goes directly to the data manager first before our office begins to review it. Once the data manager has reviewed that information, whether or not they agree or disagree, that information then comes to us and we confirm that information by the data manager to reflect whether or not we agree. And sometimes the data manager can disagree with the information, but once we get it, we may disagree with them and add that information in, or vice versa, continue to remove that information to accurately give your institution the accurate information for the accurate CDR rate. The erroneous data appeal, the ER, alleges that a school's learner for the official rates include disputed data from the IDC or incorrect new data. Because of the new and or disputed data, a school's official CDR is deemed as inaccurate. You can submit this information during the official cycle, and a school's official CDR includes new and or disputed data is subject to sanctions or provisional certification based solely on the official CDR or the successful ER, either by itself or in combination of the UDA or the LSA, will result in a recalculation of the CDR below the sanction threshold. The LSA, which is usually in many cases the larger file, usually has a lot more allegations that an institution may submit, alleges that a school's cohort rate includes defaulted, FEL, or direct loans that are considered improperly serviced by the CDR purposes. Also can be submitted during the official cycle, and also indicates that the school believes that the CDR calculation includes one or more defaulted, FEL, or direct loans which were improperly serviced for CDR purposes. And finally, the economically disadvantaged appeal alleges that a school should not be subject to loss or eligibility or provisional placement or provisional certification if based on two successive 3-year rates of 30% or more. Because of the higher number of low-income students, it meets their placement of completion thresholds. This is also submitted during the official cycle, and if an EDA is successful, it exempts the school from loss of eligibility or placement on provisional certification until the next cohort default rates are released. Also keep in mind that if at any point that your appeal is deemed as unsuccessful and your institution loses its overall eligibility of direct loan or Pell or just direct loan only, you actually will lose your eligibility for 2 consecutive years. At that point, then you can reapply to the program, which would then go through your program compliance regional office. Understanding and managing CDR contact and additional resources. Here is where you would find information within our CDR guide. The CDR guide will list out all the specific information that is relevant to submitting an appeal and understanding what the cohort default rate means, and gives you all the complete and accurate detail as to what you should be submitting, how you should be submitting the information, what your letters should look like that are coming from your manager's assertion as well as your auditor's letter, and exactly how each individual appeal and or challenge should be laid out for you as an institution. Here on our website, you'll find information that will discuss specifically about what is your alerter, how to import that tool, all the information that you need specifically to understand the CDR process. Everything is listed specifically out here on our website, which will give you tutorial information, give you key and detailed information, all that you would need necessary to complete your appeal. Additional resources for the eCDR guide. You'll find information here as to what's new with the appeals user guide as it's updated every year before the rates are released. You'll find key information as far as the eCDR appeals system for what can be submitted for the IDC, UDA, NDA, and LSA. And as the ones that you see are listed here, these are the only ones that you can submit through the eCDR appeals system. All the other appeals are deemed as paper, so you actually would need to submit them and make sure that they are date stamped in order to be received and processed accurately. Submitting your appeals and adjustments, here is the website as to where you would go and access the eCDR appeals system. Keep in mind, and a lot of things that we have seen in past years is that a lot of institutions don't access eCDR appeals except when the process begins, and a lot of times you have been locked out or kicked out of the system. The eCDR appeals system automatically kicks you out after 3 months of inactivity. So our suggestion is before the rates are released in February and released again in September, that you contact us or check your access. If you're unable to get in, just to contact our office, and we'll be happy to reset your password and your user ID in order to make sure that you guys are getting your information submitted on time. Here's our contact information. There are representatives within our office who will be happy to assist you in regards to any questions that you may have or any technical issues that you may be experiencing. You can either give us a call, drop us an email, visit our website, and proceed from that point forward. I will turn this over to my colleague, Mr. Larry Eady, who will discuss the default prevention plan.
Okay. Thank you so very much, Marcus. Marcus had the opportunity to greet you because we started in the morning with good morning. I now have the honor and the privilege of greeting you with an afternoon greeting. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to our session. Before we start, I think we need to kind of be on the same page with some clear understanding. And if I'm talking to those who work with default rates, I think you can almost agree with me that number one, that the default management on your campus is an institutional responsibility. It is not a financial aid office responsibility. So if I've got any senior managers in the audience, you need to clearly understand that I'm going to dispel a myth that may have occurred. And having worked in the financial aid office myself for a number of years, I can assure you that what doesn't happen after the student signs the promissory note, completes the entrance conference, and there's actually a disbursement. Of course, we know that as a book loan. Once the loan is booked, the very next conversation never takes place from the financial aid office to the student. John, the next thing I want you to do is default on your loan. I think we can all agree that that conversation never takes place, right? But unfortunately, something happens between that point and the date of default. The second thing I think we need to agree on as we take this journey in terms of talking about cohort default rate management is the fact that we're talking about numerators and denominators, right? Our denominators are folks who went into repayment, and our numerators are the folks who went into repayment and subsequently defaulted, right? And I think each of you are in here because you probably have a concern about that thing called that numerator. And there are numbers in your numerators. But let me remind you of something that's very, very clear. Each and every school sitting in this audience should have a 0 in the numerator. And why do I say that? Why do you say that, Larry Edie? The Department of Education actually have programs that will probably fit the profile of all of your students that's in your numerator, whether they're income continued payment repayment plan programs or whether they're hardship deferment programs. Students are perhaps eligible for it, but there's a process that has to happen. But I think we can all agree that the challenges that we have is how do we make that happen? How do we make that happen? It's called relationship building. And that's kind of what I want to talk about for the remaining of the session. So we're going to talk about risk strategies. We're going to talk about creating an effective default management plan, and then targeted school engagement. And that last one is so very important, targeting school engagement. If I get my slide back up here we go. This slide is worth repeating. As a matter of fact, I call this slide the gospel of cohort default rate. It is a roadmap. It is the tool that you need to become very, very familiar with, because guess what it is? It's the tracking of your students from the time they entered grace period to the point where they default. Let's, for an example, as Marcus indicated earlier, we're currently in the 2016 cohort default year. That's the data that you have. So what we're talking about, and that's the challenge with cohort default rate, those are the students who actually entered your school or who completed your school on a traditional semester schedule in May of 2015. May 2015, those are the students who entered repayment probably in October. Graduated in May, entered repayment in October. So now, having that in mind, I know that next year, when I talk about my 17 cohort year, I'm talking about those students, for the most part, who graduated in May of 2016, who went into repayment October of 2016, so forth and so on. This becomes very important because there are certain advantages to the data. We all are aware of early stage delinquency. We're all aware of late stage delinquency. We all are aware of rehab programs for students. But all of those are driven based on the dates. So if we clearly understand who our numerators are and denominators, it would give us an advantage in terms of trying to figure out what we need to do with those students. Okay, give an example. Again, 3 years later, we have a student who completed their program 3 years earlier. And our responsibility is to track those students for those 3 years. So it puts us a little bit at a disadvantage. And for those who are at community colleges, you have a double jeopardy there, because your students who borrowed from you for perhaps 2 years, 3 years, they leave you, they transfer to school B, they have your loans they carry with them, they're now at school B, they're creating new loans at school B. You're concerned about their performance at school B, because obviously if they default on school B loan, the chances are they're going to default on school's A loan as well. And you're part of that process. So we have to be built in some kind of mechanism that we're able to track our transfers out. I recall at one point, as a financial aid administrator, I had this one student, and regardless of what kind of customer service I did, she was always at the president's office every morning. And I didn't get a call from the president's secretary. Larry, I have Mary Sue. Please take care of Mary Sue. So she would come down to my office and say, Mary Sue, how can I help you? No, everything is fine. So finally, I was at graduation, and she was in the line getting her cap and gown. So I said to the staff, I said, thank God Mary Lou is graduating. So the default management coordinator tapped me on my shoulder and says, no, Mr. Eady, we have to track her. At that time, 2 additional years. We have to have a relationship with Mary Sue. It's called a relationship. So many borrowers are having difficulties repaying their loan. I think that's obvious. And even though the national rate is on the decline, for us individually, we have seen an increase in our own individual rates. So what does that result in? Compliance challenges for our schools, okay? Because there are consequences for students and there are consequences for schools. So we all are familiar with, or should be familiar with, Code of Federal Regulation 668.14. That's where we require schools who've gone through a change of ownership. If you're new in the program, you have to create this thing called a call default management plan. And if you go online, there are requirements for those plans. Our focus this afternoon, at least, is going to be on those plans that's familiar with or have to be in compliance with those that's related to Code of Federal Regulation 668.2.17. And those plans are required for school whose cohort default rate exceeds 30%. So if you're one of those unfortunate ones in the audience where your rate's greater than 30%, you're required to create a cohort default rate plan. Who should create a plan that's compliant with 668.217? If you're sitting in this room, you should have a 667 plan, not a 214 plan, but at least a 661 plan. And remember what I said from the onset. This is whose responsibility? An institutional responsibility, not a financial aid responsibility. So when we're talking about creating a plan, we're not talking about financial aid office having some additional stuff to do. We're talking about the default management task force that we'll talk about later on. So school may wish to complete or create this plan involuntarily. It's not required if you're under 30%. You don't have to revise it if you're under 30% for a second year. But not to have a plan that's not consistent with that of Code of Federal Regulation 668.17 is sort of counterproductive. Let me share this with you. We have evidence that those schools who have created those plans that 668.217 compliant have experienced a tremendous decrease in their call default rate just by virtue of the elements that's in that plan, which makes it very important. So again, for the first year, it's 30%. If you're above 30% for the second year, you have to revise that plan, tell us what you're going to do differently, submit it to us, and then we'll review it and make such suggestions and recommendations. And of course, if it's above 30% for the third year, then Marcus Group will provide their oversight and make the recommendation to the compliance team for suspension in the program. So it becomes really important. And the unfortunate part about it, folks, when you're in that 10 to 15%, folks, the senior management team, they're not alarmed. So trying to get support becomes difficult. But once your rate get what we call in the gray area, that's anywhere between 17 and 29%, obviously you're going to get the attention of many of the folks and the support of the folks around campus. So what are some of the things that you can do? First of all, establish a team. And when you do that, a very effective team is when the financial aid administrator is not the person who's the chairperson of the team. So if I call your school and you have the financial aid director as the chairperson of your team, or I review your plan and I see that person as a chairperson, I put marks through, red marks, and I send it back to you. Not going to work. Because remember, the problem did not initiate where? In the financial aid office. The loan was only booked in the financial aid office. And technically, once the loan is booked, student signs a promissory note, it becomes a contract agreement between the student and the servicer, right? So it becomes, something happens to that student once they leave the financial aid office and then go into the environment. And that's cohort default rate management, is managing the environment, addressing those issues of concern to that student. Because I think we can all agree on the same page that if that student was admitted in the correct program, graduated with the correct degree, got the correct job, commensurated with his diploma, that student would not be in your numerator, they would certainly be in your denominator. I think we all agree with that. So the question then becomes, to you and your team, is who are your defaulters? Do you know? Do you know who your defaulters are? We have numbers in your numerators. They actually represent, believe it or not, students. But do you know who they are? So you have to develop the team. And then you have to do that risk analysis. Got to paint a picture of your students. I remember, I'm a product of New Jersey, and I remember we had former Secretary of the EPA, Christy Whitman, as our governor, and she thought it was okay to go to a community and kind of help the state police pat down students. So they were doing some profiling. This is good profiling, folks. This is not that kind of profiling. This is good profiling. It's kind of painting a picture of who your potential, because we can all agree, commercial credit, guess what? They want to know your grandmama, your great-grandmama, everybody else on the planet that's related to you. They want to know and have that part of you. As a matter of fact, we get so annoyed because every time I call stupid Verizon, the first thing they'll ask me is, can you confirm your phone number? I said, it's the same stupid phone number I gave you 35 years ago. It hasn't changed. And when it changes, I'll let you know. So stop asking me that stupid question. But the reason they're asking it is what? To mitigate their risk. To make sure that they have current information on me should my bill go unpaid. Still yet, we collect these references, and that's good. But do you know, or have you a process in place to validate that the references that you've collected are actually good references? Have you? How many times? I have a cell phone. I don't know about you guys. I must admit I'm a little older, not much older. I have a cell phone, and I'll go to the doctor's office or go to an office, and they'll ask for references. I'll have to pull up my cell phone. I don't remember anybody's address. And oftentimes, I have good people who I want to use as a reference, and I don't know their house number. So I'll kind of make up a number. Yes, that's me. I make up a number. Tell them that, okay? So finally, I do that. So you can imagine what the quality of the references that you have, the very piece of tool that you need to do what? Remind Johnny that he's eligible for hardship deferment because he wasn't able to find a job. in Pudock, Little Rock, Arkansas, where you had to go back to. But you couldn't reach him to tell him that because you have bad information from the very beginning. So you do nothing to correct this, by the way. And then the servicer who you have to partner with, they have the same bad information that you have. Got to begin to create a mechanism so you can acquire good, current, valid information, folks. And when you create this plan, it's got to be measurable. Okay? It's got to be measurable. And then you send it to us for review, and we will review it. We'll share our comments with you, folks. We'll let you know whether it's good, bad, or indifference. Because some of you like to be very creative, not understanding there's some restrictions that you can't do. And we would love to do some wonderful things that we thought about the night before. But we have to make sure it reaches all of the guidelines in terms of what policy is concerned. So again, who should develop a plan that's consistent with CFR 668.217? All of you sitting in this room should have a plan that's consistent with that. So, conduct a risk analysis. First, create an understanding of who you're dealing with, who defaulting, why they're defaulting. And part of this slide talk about late admits. We want to believe that, oh yes, those doggone late admits. If I can get the admissions office and the college to agree to admit these students by the deadline, the admissions deadline, things would be fine. And then you do your risk analysis and determine that all your late starts are your non-defaulters. Your recommendation, your plan to the college should be everybody should start late. Because they've been proven to be successful. It's not your late starts. Are they your SAP folks? Okay, who are they? Allow for an increase in effectiveness. You got to review your default plan to make sure that it's meeting the need of your projected goal for your rates. My rate is 17% this year. And we all know about the benefits of low cohort default rate, right? I often ask folks, when I do workshops, I said, do you delay certifying your loans for your first-year student? Oh, yes, we do. Let me see the hands. Oh, yes, you. Why do you do it? You know what they're saying? Oh, because the department requires us to do it. That's their blanket answer. When, in fact, they have to do it because what? The rates are greater than above the threshold for 3 years. That's why you're doing it. But if, in fact, your rates were below the threshold for 3 consecutive years, could you imagine, this is your message, by the way, to your team, could you imagine what resources would be available to the college if we can have access to those student loans from the very beginning of the term? Some schools as great as 10 days in advance of the term start. Could you imagine what this would look like? It would change the landscape of our financial structure here at the college. But because you don't give us the resource, we have to continue to delay certifying these loans, folks. There are benefits. So by doing that risk analysis, you reduce waste of time and energy and effort chasing the donkey tail. Because now, with your limited resource, you know now who you need to do what? Follow, develop a relationship with. See, I had a little thing when I was on campus. If a student who wanted to come into my office to borrow additional funds, of course I couldn't restrict it. You can't do that. Because once you put it in your PPA and they're eligible for it, got to give it to them. But what I did do, I would tell the counselors, everybody wanted additional, have them to come see me. And I would sit in my chair and I'd turn around and I'd look at them and I'm like, how can I help you? They said, well, I want additional. You want a what? Excuse me? I'd give them the father-daughter, father-son conversation talk. But the goal was to make sure that they understood that it was a loan. It's called ownership. That's part of your problem. Ownership. Do a survey on your campus of your students to find out where they are in terms of ownership with their student loans. Because a common communication you'll get back is, guess what? I didn't have a loan. I had financial aid. Loan? No, no. Matter of fact, in my church, parents are walking around, yeah, my student's going to Alabama State University. I'm from Georgia. Going to Alabama State University. And they're on financial aid. I said, yeah, but is it subsidized, unsubsidized loan? I'm not sure, but they're financial aid. See, parents are kind of not there yet. And I applaud all of the tools and stuff we are creating to enhance borrowers' communication. But unfortunately, for the most part, they're talking to folks who can understand this stuff. Have any of you, let me see the hands of those who ever read a promissory note. Oh, look, I'm impressed, guys. You're halfway there. Now, let me see the hands of you who think your students have read that promissory notes. Okay? There you go. And then, of course, you know, I can go on and talk about that, folks. But we got to find a way to develop a mechanism so that students can realize or recognize ownership with that student loan. I encourage my students when on campus who had an unsub loan to make interest payments while they're in school. I know it sounds something really crazy, but you can engage in that kind of conversation. So you need to do that. So who are your defaulters? One of the most important things a school can do with the default management program is to study those characteristics, and you've got data all over the place. You got data up the yang of your students that you can develop characteristics. Never contacted, developmental studies issues, early withdrawals, licensure exam program, exit conferencing, unsatisfactory. You've got admissions data, you've got FAFSA data. You've got data, folks. You've got historical data. Do an analysis to figure out who your defaulters are, the characteristic of your defaulters. Even the admissions office has to buy into your task force or your team because they should be able to articulate to your task force that, okay, folks, we are accepting 20 students from Larry Edey High School. And based on history, Larry Edey High School is known to produce non-graduates because of their math department or because of their science department. Should we suggest to the institution that they ought not to recruit from Larry Edey High School? Absolutely not. We don't want to do that. You know, we're all enrollment conscious, right? We don't want to do it. But what we want to do, send the message. Guess what, folks? We've got 40 students that's got some deficiencies that has to be addressed. Okay? These are the folks, based on the characteristic of my previous analysis, we've got 40 of these folks that I've got to watch. You've got non-attendance taking institutions, good, bad, or indifference. If those 40 students are on your list, you have to figure out a way to kind of verify that they are participating in the class activity. You can't afford to wait until the end of the term to figure out that your at-risk student is no longer there. Then you have to come up with an LDA, right? So you do an LDA, which happens to have been back in October. By the time you update NSLDS, by the time that information gets to the servicer, the students have already used what? Part of their grace period. Part of their in-school grace period. They've already used because of late reporting or non-reporting. Enrollment report, oh yeah, it has a definite effect on managing cohort default rate. Devastating effect on managing cohort default rate, folks. So, is academic preparedness an issue? Are there majors on your campus that's producing these numerator folks? You know, student employment, is that part of the issue? You know, late majors, I'm glad to see that many institutions have been doing a better job at encouraging students at an early stage of their career to identify a major. So you don't have students walking around in their junior year undeclared. Okay? Encouraging students to find a major early so they can, what, graduate on time at least? Okay, so again, create a picture of your at-risk bars. Identify who is not enough, but why becomes more important. And that will require input from the academic affairs and other professionals on your campus. That's the folks that are in that room in the task force. When I was able to visit campus, I said to them, before I come to your campus, you must put together, formulate folks who are going to be part of your task force, because those are folks I want to talk to, because I don't want to talk to financial aid folks. Because I've been talking to you all these years. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Talk task force folks. So I said, well, send me members of your task force. And they sent me members. Well, give me some titles. I would say, oops, nope, got to add some more folks here. Take this person out. Where's a student? Do you have a student in your task force? Because you need to know what's going on your campus. You know, to the extent, is it housing? Is housing your issue? Students walking away housing? You know the attitude, folks. I'm not paying back my student loan. The food was terrible. I'm like, what the food got to do with loan? You know, food was terrible, so I'm not paying my student loan, but I hate that school. Okay, but the reality is, those are students that are in your numerators. And your goal is to get them out of there, right? So are we to ignore those, what we seem to think of as trivialist concerns? Or should we begin to have an intellectual discussion about food service? I've been to some campuses, and they got a valid point in some cases. Food is terrible. But these are the kinds of conversation that your task force need to be engaged with. So the benefits of a plan, folks, obviously is to reduce borrowers' default, promote school success, avoid negative reflection on the school. Negative reflection on the school. Marcus talked about the draft rates in February. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Columbia Tribune, the Alabama paper. They're not concerned with the draft rates because they understand they're draft, subject to change. That's what I mean, draft, right? Not final. But guess what? They can't wait till September to publish your school name in the paper. To publish your school name in the paper. Of course, if you're doing good, they don't kind of mention it. They say other schools. If you're not doing well, you're at the top of the list. So your school image becomes important. And how does that affect? Why is that important? Your enrollment folks sitting in that task force, they ought to be concerned with the school's image. If we're going to talk about enrollment, avoid the schools being provisionally certified. You don't want to do that. You want to avoid those things. And of course, benefits. Avoid the loss of Title IV eligibility, increase access to private loans, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about the composition of this team. It's not complicated. As I mentioned before, it ought not to be the Director of Financial Aid. Who are you recommending, Larry Eady? Tell me, please tell me. I'm going to tell you, folks. It ought to be generally that guy or lady who walks around campus, you know, the assistant to the president, who just getting everybody's business. That should be the person, at least somebody at that level on your task force as a chairperson of your task force. Why is that important? Because, folks, there are going to be discussions at the task force meetings that's going to require some resource commitment. And who makes the decisions on a college campus for resources? The president, right? So having someone from the president's office on your task force, at least if not chairperson, assistant chairperson, at least that person can go back to the president and say, guess what they talked about today? We need to hire 2 more academic advisors. So the president knows in advance what the plan is going to be proposed. So enrollment management, obviously, other folks in your team, as many. There's no such thing as minimum numbers of your team. The more the merrier. The more the merrier. And you can rotate members of your team. You know, sometimes it's not easy to get faculty members to sit on your team. But guess what? At least when I was on campus, I always had a friend of mine or a fraternity brother who was a faculty member. And I would say, John, man, I need your help. At least start the process for me. And once folks saw that John participated, others were encouraged to be part of the team. The registrar, the admissions folks, as I said, enrollment management team. And of course, it's not effective if you don't have regularly scheduled meetings. Everybody has Outlook now. Just send out an Outlook invite for the next 6 months to a year, and come up with assignments and duties and agendas. Provide training about cohort default rate. This is where the financial aid administrator can be very resourceful. Okay, you're gonna do the data analysis, you're gonna take it back to the team, and you're gonna say to the team, based on my numbers, resulted in students in the biology, let's say basket weaving course, major. The students that were majoring in basket weaving, those are the students who are defaulting. So, Mr. VP of Academic Affairs, what do you propose that we do about this? May need some restructuring, okay? May need some restructuring. So these are all available to you. So assign responsibilities, evaluate your progress, and then celebrate your accomplishment. Set realistic goals. I'm at 17 now. Next year we want to be at 16. But be careful when you use the word next year, because if you refer back to that chart, guess what, folks? As we speak, it's already too late to have an impact on next year's rate. It's already too late. That ended September 30th of this year. Right? So you get your draft rate in February and your official rate next September. Too late for 17, cohort default rate 17. We need to be working on 18 and 19 and 20. And the good news, see, I'm a bearer of good news, folks. I truly am. See, I let Marcus do the bad part. He talks about punishment and all this other crazy stuff. I'm going to tell you about the good stuff. The good news is that you've got this thing called loan record detail. Matter of fact, when Marcus's office sends you out this package with your draft rates and your official rates, there's a file in there called the Loan Record Detail Report Extract File. Okay? Everybody familiar with that? Loan Record Report Extract File. If you were to go on IFAP, under default prevention, 3-year cohort default rate, you'll see a link that says the Loan Record Detail Report Import Tool. Okay? It gives you instructions of how to download it. It results in an Excel spreadsheet. Okay? And then it tells you loan identifies student name, date of claim, date of delinquent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a roadmap so that you can target those students who are either late, could be rehabbed, all those students shouldn't be there at all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's your roadmap. See, I applaud the wise minds in DC who came up with this, because this is awesome. I can tell you that old system, the old loan record detail report, I used to look at the thing, it was so challenging to me. I'm like, do I really have to talk about this? But now I feel good about talking about the loan record detail report import tool, because it's just that simple. Okay, so you got the tools available to you. So leveraging point, folks, admissions. Admissions is your leveraging point. As I pointed out before, you got admissions data. You got to figure out who are being admitted into your institutions. Entrance and exit conferencing. And even though most of you use the online tool and it's there for your usage, not a requirement. The online entrance conferencing is a requirement. The online tool is not a requirement. So if you go into COD and disable that function, you can actually do your entrance conferencing one-on-one. Why would you want to do that, Larry Edie? Remember ownership? Remember an opportunity, an additional opportunity to say to Johnny, Jill, and Mary, you can't just do it for your at-risk, you got to do it for everybody. But when you say to them, like, this is ownership, this is a student loan that has to be repaid. And here are your resources on NSLDS and all other electronic resources available to you so you can monitor the amount of loans that you're borrowing and the interest rates and all the other good stuff is related to that. And then all of a sudden you see your rates start to drop. Now I'm under 15% for 3 years. Now I don't have to delay certifying my loans for my first-time, first-year students. Now I can have them go back to the web. It's still available then, in what form or fashion, and do it there. But at least I've enhanced my plan requirement to do interest conferencing. Probation SAP, folks. Your SAP policy affects your cohort default rate. Take a look at your SAP policy. Is it meeting the needs of your students? Okay, I was visiting a school, not too long, community college, and they had after the first term, student had to have a 2.0. And that's all well and good. I'm not knocking 2.0. But these are students with no admissions requirement. All they had to have blood in their body, okay, and clothes on. But these students from the community, but they had to have a 2.0 at the end of the first term. And they gave them loans. And I thought, oh my God, this is a roadmap to disaster. You're discouraging a kid. We talked about the number of students who are non-traditional students. They have to have a 2.0. As I said, for those schools who have it, don't go back and say, Larry, you said we shouldn't have a 2.0. I'm not saying that at all. Let your task force tell you that. Let your task force make that recommendation to your management team at your college. If you discover that that's the issue, because you have the data. I've got 35% of my students in my numerators are those students who had SAP issues in the first term of the program. Sends a message, and then I look around to my left at my support services, and they kind of don't exist, right? There are 2 counselors and a counseling center. I've got plans that's totally ineffective. Nobody's monitoring the SAP plan. It's just there because it looks good. You know how you guys are, with your SAP committee. Oh yeah, we got everybody on the SAP committee, but nobody shows up, and the SAP committee is not required in the first place. But nevertheless, it looks good on paper. So you got to begin to examine these auxiliary services to make sure they support your data. Okay? So, former developer, in closing, folks, got to do that team. It's of paramount importance. Because even though some of you are the go-to person on campus, you're the it. Welcome campus. Who's the it on this campus? Oh, there she is. Oops, there she is. Even though you're the it, you need some reinforcement. You can't do it by yourself. It's not your job. You're operating outside of your gifts. You can't solve the problem. And I know you probably think you can leave the financial aid office and go into the VP of Academic Affairs and do their job, go into the registrar and do her job in the enrollment report. You can do everybody's job on campus. But it's not your job. It's not your responsibility. You need to invite those who have the expertise at the table to have that conversation with, engage in that conversation with. And once you do that and start having an honest conversation about your students, and you lay it out on the table and begin to address those concerns, then you're halfway there. But most importantly is communication. Utilize the traditional stuff. You guys are doing some wonderful stuff. One of the things I always remind the audience, we don't have students at the Department of Ed. I'm in the Atlanta Regional Office. I don't have students. So I can't practice. I can't do some crazy stuff. But some of you are doing some really wonderful things. Reminder letters, dear John, put a little heart on the envelope so they'll open it. You got Instagram, you got Facebook, you got all kinds of new stuff since I came through the system. So you continue to utilize those good practices that you're doing, those traditional stuff. But develop that plan, come up with some strategies. Utilize students' success based on your, again, default prevention strategies. Best option for schools is to use a combination of those 2 approaches, folks. your good things that are working for you in addition to your data analysis and your development of your plan with those activities that are required in this Code of Federal Regulations 668.217 plan. Make sense? Clear as muddy water? Okay? Okay, this is the time where you get a chance to come to the mic and ask us questions. Don't be shy. Or share with us some of your good practices on your campus, what you're doing, because you're the school that's got this less than 15% cohort default rate. Share with the audience what you're doing on your campus. Any comments, any questions? Einbag? Yes.
Well, I thank you for your expertise. And we are a small community college that, of course, has open enrollment. And I feel like I'm in a no-win situation. A few years ago, I started heavily attending all of our college orientation classes and presenting information there about student loans and about the real consequences of those loans and the debt, the average debt and the average repayment, the years. Does your degree, your pursuit of your job, are you going to be able to make enough money to make your loans, those types of things. And it's wonderful to see the light come on a student, their eyes get huge, and they, many of them will march right over to my office and cancel their loans that they're been awarded. That, along with the enrollment issues, my student borrowers are going down. That number is going down.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm helping students be responsible about their borrowing, but I'm suffering the consequences of my default rate going up because I have fewer borrowers in that. And so then learning about the new borrower tool that they will be doing, I can see in my mind someone sitting at the computer outside our offices seeing their debt and running in and say, oh my God, I have this much debt, I don't want my loan this year. So I don't have any suggestions, I just want you to feel my pain.
And you know, I got to tell you, and I do, I sincerely do. If I could change something, the first thing I would change is ask Congress to consider default loan dollars as part of the formula. And if that happens, I think it's going to help a school like yours and others who have smaller enrollments, because at one point, if you have 100 students and 50 of your student defaults in a cohort year, you have a 50% cohort default rate, versus taking all that 100 student, putting it in the University of Arizona's numerator, and their default rate is still less than 1%. So yeah, it is a challenge, and I think we need, first of all, awareness is of utmost importance, especially for those schools that are considering leaving the program. You have to remember that you have a history. You know, it's 3 years back. You have a history of students that's in the cycle, and sometimes it's beyond that point, because you may have a student who's in deferment and a cohort period come out of deferment back into repayment during that cohort period. We're still going to capture that student, right, Marcus? Yes. Right. So sometimes it's longer than those 3 years. So yes, it's one of those uphill balance. I've got a few students, and what do I do? How do I manage that? The good thing is that when that happens, your target focus becomes smaller. So now I've got 20 students, and I'm going to follow those 20 students one-on-one as opposed to 200 students where I can no longer do that. But the key here, folks, remember, is to always have an idea of where they are and that you're communicating with them, making a phone call. That's what I'm saying, students, having students to make phone calls. They can't discuss their loan content, but what they can do is get together as a student organization, as a sorority and a fraternity, and just call students home, their parents home, and says, hi, my name is Johnny. I understand that Mary is here, so, you know, kind of discuss it with your legal folks of what you can and cannot do on campus. But develop whatever you can so that you can create updated information, because there are some students that you're just not going to be able to salvage. I don't care what you do. You can do dance, tapping, fall on your head, roll over. You're not going to cure them. But those are the students, and so there's a provision that allows sort of a breathing room for those. But for the most part, we want to be able to make sure that that student who, in fact, is hardship unemployed and can document that, you know, because you remember the rights and responsibility, that they take advantage of their rights and responsibility. They do that for 3 years, they're not in your numerator, and then, you know, it helps the school out.
Thank you for your suggestions, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question about, we've done the data analysis and we've really gotten a lot of insights from that, and you know there were some surprises and things, so and it's probably more in depth than we've ever done before. So looking at that and then deploying a strategy to go along with the data, that's where I think I'm struggling with as far as moving forward on a really, you know, highly developed plan here.
Right.
So because you know, I don't know, and I'd love to hear from others in the room, you know, once you figure out who they are, what are the best practices? What are those strategies that have worked and have been the most effective? You know, of course, there's not unlimited resources, and that's an issue. So, so that would be my question to the group and to you. And then also, I would wonder, who do you think is an appropriate person to chair one of those teams?
Okay. To answer your first question, once you've done the data analysis, and that's why it's so important to formulate a task force that's consistent with representative from folks across campus. Every office is part of that team. You go back and you have this discussion with your co-chair, your second question. Someone from the executive office branch, you know, senior assistant to the president, whoever that person is, a VP of student affairs, somebody who's on the president's cabinet as part of that team. Because the idea here is not to have that person do a lot of work, so you can confer with this person the data results before you expose it to the team. It says, look, we've done the data analysis, we've determined that it's our biology program where our students are failing. And based on my phone conversation, they left here because of A. So now you have this discussion with your chairperson, and you two come up with some strategy. How do you think? The good news is here, folks. We are going to expose something that's already been discussed. You may not have been part of the conversation, but it's because you got this academic standing committee that everybody has on campus. This is really an extension of that academic standing committee. So now you're saying to your co-chairperson, what is the strategy here? So, okay, so now it's a program that we're offering that's an issue. Who's the person who's responsible for that? VP of Academic Affairs. So now we're going to go to the VP of Academic Affairs. We said, before we go, not at the meeting, but before we go to the meeting, you know what? We need to have this conversation. I've done a data analysis, and it seems as though it's that program, that basket weaving program. It's that French program. It's that Chinese program, whatever it is. And these programs seems to have a common thread between our defaulters and our school. You know, what do you propose that we do about it? Could you be prepared to talk about that program at the committee meeting? So then he comes and he talks about that targeted program. Other people at the table offer suggestions and recommendations as to what the school can do to perhaps change the structure or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one example, but it's very similar to other issues that you may find. And again, it could be late admits. It could be late admits. Your students who are being admitted late after the start of the program are those students who are the majority of students who are defaulting. So obviously the admissions director, along with the enrollment manager, have to come up with some kind of recommendation to improve, not to stop it, but okay, now that we've got late admits, guess what we're going to do? We're going to identify those students, okay, and then we're going to give them some extra support services. Yeah. So we're going to require them to go to academic advising for the first 6 weeks of the program, because they didn't do that before. Right. Now they're requiring late admits to go to academic advising, mandatory academic advising for the first 6 weeks. Later on, 3 years later, you do another data analysis, you've determined, guess what? They're no longer my late admits.
Right.
Now they're my graduates. Then you got a real problem. but
Thank you.
But you see, anybody else have any suggestions or comments from terms of how their teams and task force have restructured their process on campus? Let me see the hands of those who have task force, who've developed task force. Okay, great, thank you. Let me see the hands of those after the session that's going to go back and develop a task force. Wonderful. Marcus, we've done an awesome job, I think. We'll read the evaluation and see, but I think we've done an awesome job. Because at the end of the day, folks, it's about moving the needle, okay? Moving the needle. Because as I remind folks every single day, I'm concerned with your numerator. I am. I'm truly concerned with your numerator, but I'm most concerned about your students. I'm most concerned about your students because what I ask you to do while you're doing the data analysis is look at your default rate 5 years later. Look at your default rate 5 years later. Those consequences of defaulting on a loan becomes real. It destroys the student, and some of you, your cousins and daughters and sons are going to marry one of them. It's going to destroy the family, and then it's going to destroy the community. So it becomes of paramount importance, at least if a student can't find a job or in an income that's not commensurate with their degree, that at least they're in some type of programs that our services offer. So you have a relationship with your servicer. That is most important. Most important. And a lot of us don't know who our services are. You got to do that. Because at the end of the day, one of the provisions that would allow you to have a successful appeal, should you be subject to sanction, is a services appeal. But if you haven't worked with your servicer, how can you do that? Yes.
I just want to say I have a testimonial. I'm with Langston University, Langston, Oklahoma. When I came to the institution, we were on the second year of 30%, going toward a third year. And we worked with the department, worked with your office, a lot of help, developed the plan, did a lot of things. We also added a default coordinator to our office, and I'm proud to say, and that was 2011, and I'm proud to say we're not where we want to be, but we are much lower than 30. We didn't lose our program. We did go down to at least 18. It's inching up a little bit, but because of putting the plan in place, because we were able to, your office was able to help my president understand that it wasn't a financial aid problem, that it took the university together to work through this process, we're now in a better position. So I just want to testify that the plan works. And again, I think we're on our way. And I might add one more thing. I just lost my default coordinator, so if somebody's looking for a job, see me when you get through.
Let's give her a hand. That's tremendous. Tremendous success. Thank you. Thank you. I'm always elated when I hear stories like that because it really impacts my heart because of the seriousness of what we talk about. And the truth of the matter is we don't get a lot of recognition, a lot of help, internally or externally. So your job is so important, one of the most important. And as a matter of fact, like the financial literacy track, I always say to school, if you do it as a new student orientation program, forget about it. But if you offer it as part of the curriculum, that's when it becomes effective. And I can buy into that. So when I read your plan and I say, oh, it's a freshman experience thing, I'm like, no, no, no. It's not going to accomplish very much. It's a step in the right direction, but it wouldn't get you there as fast as where you need to be. And so at the end of the day, it's about employing some of these strategies, getting total buy-in, and eventually having this task force become a standing executive committee of the campus, not controlled by you at all. That's the goal. Then it becomes really effective. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.